Welcome back. Or if it's your first time here, thank you for stopping by this quiet little corner of time. Tonight we won't walk through gardens or castles, but down the shadowy alleys of honour, blood and silence. Behind the shining armour and songs of glory lies a tale few ever tell, the hidden side of medieval knights, of pain, sacrifice and deep, lonely silence. Was knighthood truly an honour? Or just a steel prison-trapping body, childhood and soul? If you love drifting softly into the past, like and subscribe. Come sit by the warm fire, ready? Let sleeping history uncover the dark side of knighthood, now. No one in the Middle Ages ever woke up and said, "You know what? I think I'd love to wear a 30-kilogram suit of armour, swear lifelong loyalty to a mentally unstable lord, and die for a piece of land I'll never own, not even a square foot of it." Becoming a knight wasn't a choice. It was a systemised accident, a golden trap, an oath of honour ripped from your throat before your baby teeth had even fallen out. You didn't choose to be a knight. You were thrown into it, literally and figuratively. If you were the second son of a noble, congratulations. You wouldn't inherit land, wouldn't wield real power, but you'd get a horse, a sword, and a shield bigger than your own body. Then they'd toss you onto the battlefield and expect you to bring honour to your house, or die cleanly in the process. Knights weren't graceful heroes on white horses like the poetry says. They were walking slabs of meat in metal shells, half-cooked inside their armour in mid-July, smelling like forgotten sheep. Every time they mounted a horse, it was a gamble with their spine. Every time they removed a helmet, it was a wrestling match with their own skull. And you think they lived gloriously? Not quite. They lived off the pity and leftover meals of their lord. They fought to defend honour, which usually meant someone's rice field or pigsty. They camped outside, slept next to horses and rats, and woke up with backs so sore it felt like their spines had been yanked out through their nostrils. And when there was no war, they still didn't get a break. They did duties, crushing peasant uprisings, parading on horseback for spectacle, and sometimes chasing bandits, who were often faster, smarter, and better fed. A few knights did win glory, land and reputation, but most of them, buried in shallow graves by the roadside, remembered by a misspelled name on a crooked headstone, and a funny tavern song that no one sang quite right. Because in the end, being a knight wasn't a dream. It was a life sentence in a suit of iron, chasing something called glory, only to realise the only one who ever truly won was the lord they served with their blood. When people imagine a medieval knight, they often picture a towering warrior galloping across a wild plain, silver armour gleaming in the sunlight, cloak billowing behind, and a great sword flashing like lightning. But they tend to forget one simple, crucial truth. Man, helmet or not, must eat. And eating, dear friends, was a regulated, limited, and sometimes odorous art, in a world where hygiene was a distant luxury. When we think of a knight's meal, we're tempted to picture long banquet tables draped in velvet, glowing candlelight, golden roasted meats, and overflowing goblets of wine. The reality, far less dazzling, and at times distinctly burnt. It's true that knights ate a lot of meat, but by a lot we mean more bones than flesh, more fat than lean, and more odd smells than appetizing aromas. Game birds, rabbits, boars, cattle, and occasionally something fancier like swan or peacock, were roasted over fire or stewed in enormous pots with vegetables and spices. Sounds delicious, until you realise the stew was often so thick it resembled glue, and the main seasoning was salt, buckets of it, because remember, refrigerators wouldn't be invented for several centuries, and vegetables? Ah, no. Vegetables were for peasants. A proper knight didn't want to be seen as soft by eating boiled greens. As for tableware, forget porcelain plates. Medieval knights often ate off of bread. Not the crisp, airy baguettes we know today, but thick, brick-like slabs of stale, flavourless bread called trenchers. They doubled as plates to hold meat and gravy, absorbing all the drippings. After the meal, diners might eat their plate, or, if feeling charitable, hand it to the poor, by which point it was soaked in cold grease and sauce. Cutlery? Mostly just knives. Sharp, personal, always carried on one's belt. Knights used them to slice meat, poke at food, and sometimes even to shave. Forks weren't in wide use yet, so fingers, particularly the thumb and index, did most of the heavy lifting. thumb, to push food into the mouth, index finger, to steady it while carving, and here's something you might not expect. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg and ginger were wildly popular, not necessarily for their taste, but for their bragging rights. These spices were imported from India or Southeast Asia via long and perilous trade routes, and they cost a fortune. A knight who used lots of spice was subtly saying, "I'm rich, I've travelled, and I don't care how much it costs to mask the taste of my oversalted half-burnt stew." In fact, there were times when spices were literally worth more than gold. They were kept in locked chests like treasure. A handful of cinnamon could buy a cow, and a pinch of pepper could salvage the honour of a chicken roasted to charcoal on the outside and still clucking on the inside. If you lived back then, you'd quickly understand why everyone drank beer. Drinkable water was almost non-existent. Wells were often polluted, streams ran past livestock pens, and ponds teemed with larvae. So the people, from toddlers to elders, turned to weak beer. Not the kind to get you drunk, not even particularly tasty, but it was safe. This everyday beer was brewed in bulk across monasteries, castles and peasant homes. A farmhand could down 3 litres a day and still be sharp as ever. And of course, knights were no exception. They drank light beer, wine and cider with nearly every meal. Beer, with low alcohol content, was the go-to drink, simply because it was cheap to make and safer than well water. That said, medieval beer didn't yet have hops, so it was bitter, slightly sour and tasted somewhat like fermented porridge water. But hey, at least it didn't kill you, unlike that pigsty-adjacent stream. For knights living in southern Europe, where grapes grew better than grain, wine was a daily staple. However, don't dream of the rich, ruby red seen in films. Wine back then was often cloudy, full of sediment, and usually watered down because it was both sour and expensive. Those who enjoyed a stronger taste would let it ferment until it was basically vinegar with ambition. There was also a medieval version of energy drink, mead or honey wine. This was a drink for those trying to look noble, or who had just won a battle. Thick, sweet and luxurious mead flowed freely at feasts and celebrations. In winter, knights might warm themselves with mulled wine, simmered with cinnamon, cloves and even black pepper. Yes, the same black pepper worth its weight in gold. It was a rare treat, a warm reward after slogging through muddy marches, frozen toes, and a losing battle against lice in your waistband. A night's meal often lasted hours, not because of the slow cooking, but because of the rituals. Every cut of meat might come with a heroic tale, a Latin poem, or a sermon on virtue. There were strict rules. Don't lick your knife. Don't wipe grease on your trousers. Don't sniffle too loudly. And above all, never eat with your left hand. Why? The left hand was the unclean hand, often reserved for visits to the privy. Only the right hand was for eating, praying and commanding. At grand feasts you might have someone fanning you, musicians playing in the corner, and even mimes or jesters entertaining the table, while you tried to chew through something resembling cold mortar paste. If you imagine knighthood as a life of gourmet feasts and elegant living, well, you did get to wear shining armour, which may slowly wreck your spine. As for the food, sure, it beat what the peasants had, but don't expect Michelin stars for meat glue and vinegar wine. In the flickering glow of torches against the cold stone walls, a knight sighed. Not because of the battle, not because of unrequited love, but because it was time to bathe. Imagine yourself as a valiant 13th century knight. You've just returned from a long campaign, reeking of horse sweat, smoke, and more than a little blood. What do you dream of? A hot bath, fluffy white bubbles, and soft music in the background. Sorry, those are luxuries from 1,000 years in the future. In reality, bathing inside a medieval castle was a rare and terrifying event. There were no bathrooms in castles. If you wanted a bath, you had to order your servants to haul out a giant wooden tub into the middle of a room, heat water bucket by bucket over a wood fire and fill it up by hand. Then, if you were lucky, you could hire 2 strong lads to pour water evenly over you. If not, well, grab a ladle and start scooping. Things got even trickier in winter. The cold was so brutal that many knights would rather face a sword than face a splash of icy water. So instead they would dip linen cloths in warm water mixed with fragrant oils, quickly wipe only the essential areas, throw their clothes back on, and and done. This could go on for weeks, even months, until man and horse smelled indistinguishably alike. At the time, people believed frequent bathing weakened one's strength and opened the pores, inviting disease in. Some nights even boasted, "I bathe on Easter and Christmas, sometimes I skip one." When nature called, medieval knights didn't stroll into a private, softly lit bathroom with rolled lavender-scented toilet paper waiting in a basket. No, they made their way to something far more regal, a guardrobe. This wasn't a room at all, but rather a narrow, shadowy stone nook built slightly off the side of a castle wall where everything dropped straight down, sometimes into a deep pit, sometimes into the moat. Yes, that moat. If you were lucky, there was a wooden seat with a hole carved into it. If not, you perched on cold stone and prayed you wouldn't slip. And of course, there was no soft triple-ply toilet paper. Instead, there was straw, or dry leaves, or scraps of torn fabric, often recycled from the cloaks of dead soldiers, or, if all else failed, your left hand. Which, as you might now appreciate, is why shaking hands with the right hand became such a sacred custom. Underneath their gleaming armour, many knights wore leather padding, which, after weeks in the field, became a sponge for sweat, horse dung, and sometimes human waste, in case you missed your step on the guardrobe's slippery stone ledge. Washing it? Unthinkable. Washing soaked leather meant ruining it. Wet leather would rot, crack, or shrink, so the stench grew stronger by the day. And how did they deal with it? They didn't. Well, unless you count dousing yourself in strong perfumes, burning incense, or simply pretending everything was fine. There was no toothpaste, no minty mouthwash. Knights cleaned their teeth with wood ash, crushed mint leaves, or ground pistachio shells. How well that worked depended on the teeth. Cavities were simply tolerated, until the tooth rotted out or until a physician yanked it out with iron tongs the size of a horseshoe forge. To mask the body odour, nobles preferred strong scents, thick perfumes made from resins, lavender oil, or imported Eastern incense. And their hair, no shampoo, no round brushes, just a wooden comb, a few drops of oil, if you were rich, and long tangled hair, often tied back and tucked under a steel helmet, unwashed for weeks. Sometimes, after a particularly muddy, bloody and sweaty campaign, a knight would simply shave it all off. Each day for a night began before the sun even had a chance to rise. There was no such thing as sleeping in the world of chivalry. When the first chapel bell rang, usually around 4 a.m, a knight had to drag himself from his cold, hard wooden bed and head straight to morning prayer. This wasn't a mere formality, it was a duty. A good knight lived devoutly, for the ideal of fighting for God, defending the weak, was something praised by both church and crown. And right after that, the easiest part of the day was over. Combat training began. Sword drills, horseback riding, jousting, strength training, all consumed the entire morning. Forget gyms or personal trainers. A medieval knight had muddy fields, wooden stakes to stab, and weapons heavy enough to make modern actors weep. That sword you picture from the movies? In real life, it was heavy, clunky, and required massive upper body strength. Training went on for hours until your arms gave out or your knees buckled. But rest? Not a chance. Resting too soon was weakness, and weakness was shameful. Lunch was quick and basic. Cold meat, black bread and cheese hard enough to chip a tooth. No royal banquets with golden goblets and roasted swans. Those were reserved for feasts, not regular Tuesdays. In the afternoon, unless summoned to court or a noble audience, a knight would be back in the saddle, patrolling lands, practicing the lance, or preparing for tournaments. If he was among the lucky few taught to read, afternoons might include lessons in Latin, law, and history. Think knights spent their afternoons playing music or writing poetry. That's the legend. In truth, most entertainment was more training, or performing skills before nobles to maintain their status. But yes, there were rare moments of leisure. In the evening, knights could gather with squires, fellow warriors, or their lord to share stories, tales of battle, dragons, saints, and near-death encounters in dark forests. The best storyteller might win admiration and wine. The boring ones quietly went back to chewing their hard bread. Some knights were talented in singing or playing the lute. This was a social advantage. Poetry and philosophy were also encouraged, not because everyone was an art lover, but because it refined a man, lifting him from being just a sword swinger into the ranks of nobility. At night, a knight didn't simply lie down and dream of glory. Beds were wooden frames stuffed with straw or coarse cloth. Wool blankets were rare. Most covered themselves with rough linen or curled up in their cloaks. Sharing a bed was common, with squires, comrades, or guards. It was a way to stay warm and stay safe. Private rooms didn't really exist. Instead, sleeping areas were long communal halls, lit by dim candlelight, filled with the sound of snoring and creaking floorboards. And sleep didn't always last till morning. Many knights would wake during the night, to pray, stand guard, or swap shifts. In the medieval mind, night belonged to demons, and midnight prayers were seen as both spiritual armour and real courage. We often assume that being born into a noble family in the Middle Ages was a privilege, a passport to a life of abundance, respect, and freedom from the suffering endured by the peasantry. And in some respects, that isn't wrong. Noble-born children didn't have to toil in the fields, starve during bad harvests, or be treated as living property like the serfs. But for boys born into noble families with a military tradition, especially those whose fathers, uncles, or grandfathers were knights, that privilege was also a curse. As early as age 6 or 7, a noble-born boy would be sent away from his parents' home to live in the castle of another lord, sometimes a distant relative, sometimes a complete stranger. The purpose wasn't to go to boarding school like in modern times, but to begin the long, grueling process of training to become a knight. The term page was the first step in the knightly training system. These pages lived more like servants, attending to adult knights, carrying their boots, cleaning weapons, helping with armour, and holding horses. In exchange, they were expected to learn the trade from the very men they were destined to become. But at that age, how many children truly understood what they were walking into? No mother's embrace, no father's advice, no carefree play or childhood innocence. Everything was replaced by discipline, structure, and a forced silence. A page was not allowed to cry, not allowed to whine, not allowed to ask why. Obedience was everything, because that was honour. Unlike the romantic image of a boy happily riding horses and learning swordplay as if it were a game, the reality of knight training was brutally harsh. These young boys were required to learn how to ride a warhorse long before they were tall enough to reach the stirrups, how to wield real weapons, swords, spears, maces, bows, not for show, but for survival in actual battle, how to fight, tactics, strength training, one-on-one combat, group skirmishes, and even battlefield simulations, how to practice etiquette, religion, and proper behaviour, how to kneel correctly, how to speak to superiors, how to uphold Christian morals. No days off, no right to refuse. Every action, the way they stood, looked, or answered questions, could become a reason for punishment if done incorrectly. And punishments were far from mild. Beatings, confinement in dark rooms, kneeling on stones, or being denied food were common. All of it served one purpose: to teach the child that there is no place for fear, weakness, or self-compassion in a knight. In today's society, children are encouraged to explore their individuality, to have their rights protected, and to learn in a nurturing environment. But in the Middle Ages, none of that existed, at least not for aspiring knights. A boy could be mocked, severely punished, or even denied dinner simply for crying after falling off a horse. He might be beaten for not being able to lift a sword, or ridiculed for showing fatigue or complaining. And so, in this environment, many boys matured in distorted ways. Some became cruel, some numbed their emotions, some learned to pretend to be strong, but all of them learned one lesson: never show weakness, not even to yourself. If they had a childhood, it was a memory crushed into the darkest corner of their minds. There were no games, no innocent friendships. The few relationships they had were often shaped by competition. Who was stronger, tougher, more praised by the instructor? In the world of nobility, honour was not just a virtue, it was an obligation. Every child carried the weight of their family name, and with it came overwhelming expectations. You must not disgrace your father. This family has never raised a coward. If you fail, you're no longer one of us. These words, whether spoken aloud or implied, were repeated like a curse, turning the child into the bearer of the family's legacy. Failure wasn't just about losing, it was about bringing shame, and that shame would reflect on the father, the grandfather, the entire bloodline. In truth, the greatest fear for a noble boy wasn't being beaten. It was being seen as the shame of his family. Looking back, it becomes clear that these future knights were never given a choice. Their lives were preordained from birth. Becoming a knight wasn't a dream, it was a duty. There was no room for trying something else, following your passion, or taking a break. Freedom for them was a luxury. If not a fantasy, every step, every breath, every lesson was calibrated to meet the standards of an ideal of honour they never chose. So when we picture the brave knights charging into battle, let us not forget the child behind that armour. A child forced to grow up in silence and pressure. A childhood sacrificed for ideals. A soul forged into steel, but always at risk of breaking. Noble blood did not guarantee a gentle youth. And perhaps the most tragic part of the journey to knighthood was that these children were never allowed to simply be children. Becoming a knight wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. Whether they liked it or not, those boys had to march toward a future written for them. It's heartbreaking to think how fate played its cruel hand. Being born into the right family at the wrong time meant surrendering the most basic joys of youth. While knights may stand as symbols of honour and courage, few ever see the suffering each child endured to wear that armour. In epic films or romantic novels, the battlefield is often portrayed as a colourful arena. Flags fluttering, brave knights charging on horseback, decisive sword blows, encounters like a warrior's dance. In that imagination, war is where a man proves his honour, loyalty and nobility. But if we strip away the mythical makeup, the reality of a medieval battlefield emerges as a living nightmare. There is no light of ideals, only mud, blood, mangled flesh, and the sound of dying men. War, for knights, regardless of status, is not a game. It is collective slaughter, dressed up in an outer shell of honour and righteousness. The medieval battlefield was not a pristine meadow, nor a regulated arena. It was often a muddy field, a damp forest or harsh rocky terrain, places where movement alone was torture, let alone fighting. When hundreds or thousands of combatants clashed, there was no room for poetic vision. The clash of metal, the neighing of horses, cries of agony, pleas for mercy, all blended with the stench of blood, excrement, urine and mud. Many knights, felled by strikes, did not die immediately, but were crushed underfoot by comrades or trampling warhorses. In chaos, no one could distinguish friend from foe, and paradoxically the armour, symbol of power and protection, could become a moving coffin. A full set of knight's armour weighed from 30 to 50 kilos, not counting weapons and chainmail undershirt, while riding a horse that could be managed. But when the knight fell, something that happened frequently, they could seldom rise on their own. Historian accounts tell of knights suffocated by their own armour, especially when pinned under fallen bodies or submerged in water. In scorching heat, they could die of dehydration or heat stroke, unable to cool down beneath iron. The armour, instead of protecting them, could be their undoing. Unlike the bright silver sword swing in movies, real medieval weapons were crude, brutal, savage. The aim was not beauty, but to kill swiftly and thoroughly. Warhammers made to crush armour and shatter skulls. Flails and maces used to crush bone, even through thick plate. Battle axes needing just one blow to break a neck or shoulder. Spears and lances penetrated armour to gut the opponent. There were few elegant one-on-one duels. Instead, chaotic melees where whoever struck hardest and fastest survived. There was no sportsmanship, no honourable fairness. Many knights were stabbed from behind, ambushed, captured, then executed. Some were killed even after surrendering, out of rage, panic, or simply because there wasn't time to take prisoners. Even surviving a battle did not guarantee safety. Many died within 3 to 5 days, not from fatal wounds, but from sepsis, gangrene, or tetanus. In a pre-antibiotic era, a small gash contaminated with rust, mud, or debris could kill. Medieval medicine was virtually powerless against infection. Treatments included cutting away rotten flesh, draining pus, or leaving it to divine will. Many knights lost limbs, hands, or eyes, not in battle, but because of crude medical care. During prolonged sieges, conditions were utterly unsanitary. Polluted water, food shortages, flies infesting wounds, turning the battlefield into a death trap, even without combat. One of the most persistent myths is that knights would fight fair one-on-one. honour bound, with clear winners and losers. But war isn't a sport. War is a game of power and cunning. Knights were often ambushed, struck while retreating, or betrayed by allies. Many died at the hands of their own side, due to misunderstanding, envy, or internal power plays. Chaos on the battlefield also stemmed from the lack of effective communication. Without radios, without maps, units easily lost direction and killed their own. Smoke, blood, screaming, everything drove people to lose control. That's why many brave and skilled knights died senselessly, not due to inadequacy, but because war obeyed no fair rules, and tragically, most knightly deaths were never recorded. No songs, no statues. They died in mud, among hundreds of corpses, unnoticed. Families received only the cracked sword or dented armour returned. No grand funeral, no posthumous honour. Few became legends. The rest were nameless bodies on the battlefield, sometimes forgotten forever. The medieval battlefield wasn't a canvas for glorious epics. It was where life and death overlapped in chaos, where blood mingled with mud, and honour melted under the weight of armour and relentless brutality. If there is one thing a knight truly understood, it was this. On the battlefield there's no justice, only survivors and the fallen. When we think of medieval knights, we picture an ideal archetype. A gallant man in shining armour, astride a white steed, wielding a sword for justice, protecting the weak, living for honour and beauty. But that image belongs to Disney animations, or the romantic poetry of the 12th century. The reality of chivalry, the knight's code, was rarely upheld in practice, and above all it was created, chiefly to prevent armoured warriors from turning into feral wolves among civilians. The chivalric code was not a formal legal document, but a moral and often rhetorical system passed on through sermons, poetry, and church teaching. It upheld principles such as protecting women and children, serving one's king and god, fighting with fairness and nobility, never attacking the weak. Loyalty to one's honour and oath sounds noble, but the problem is this: these ideals mostly stayed on paper. In reality, these rules were not designed to protect society, but to restrain the brutality of the knights themselves. Medieval knights were essentially privileged warriors, bearing lethal weapons, legally permitted to kill. In many cases, they needed an ethical code simply to maintain their public image. There's no shortage of recorded instances, especially during wartime, where knights abused their power, looting, rape, murder. Sometimes justice simply meant siding with the winners. A knightly military force could be branded liberators, while behaving no differently from an organised band of brigands. During the Crusades, many Knights of Liberation pillaged cities, slaughtered locals, women and children included, under the pretext of combating heretics. Chroniclers wrote that they carried God's banner while destroying entire cities, esci. In other words, once you strapped on armour, wielded a sword, and stood in a large army, you could commit almost any atrocity and still claim to be serving the cause. Another overlooked truth: many knights weren't driven by ideals but by money. They were mercenaries disguised as nobility. When peace came, they were unemployed, and an unemployed knight was as dangerous as a learned bandit. Why? Because he still had weapons, combat skills, and a sense of superiority, and he still needed funds to maintain his lifestyle. Many knights then engaged in wars not for honour, but for wages, or just for loot. In some regions, knightly bands formed, groups of knights travelling from place to place, inventing pretexts for war or revolt, then pillaging and taking hostages for ransom, all under the banner of justice. If you were a peasant near a conflict area, you'd fear knights more than enemies. Many acts of rape, theft, and property destruction came not from outsiders, but from knights, especially when they were unpaid or hungry. A group of passing knights? You could lose your chickens, crops, daughter, or your life. Although the faith of chivalry said do not harm the innocent, reality rarely followed. There are records of knights laughing cruelly as they rode through villagers' grain fields, simply for entertainment. Another reason chivalry remained hollow: power often outranked morality. A wealthy, favoured knight could commit countless crimes with impunity. Conversely, a poor knight who committed a minor transgression would be harshly punished, sometimes as an example. This imbalance made the code conditional. It was not a rule every knight was expected to follow, but a tool to control the less powerful among the nobility. Even duels to uphold honour often concealed power struggles or land disputes. Chivalry was the glossy surface masking a war for influence and territory. Remove the myth and you see, chivalry was an ideal, a lone lamp in the darkness of the Middle Ages. Some knights may have truly believed in it, truly fought for honour, but those were exceptions. Most were driven by greed, fear, pride, or lust, wearing armour and claiming to defend righteousness. Sadly, even well-intentioned knights could be consumed by the system. A man who set out to protect people might be forced into bloody campaigns. A knight committed to justice would still obey the king, no matter how immoral the order. Chivalry is real as an idea, but rarely practiced in full. It's like a romantic moonlight reflection on a pool of blood. The beauty exists, but it's fragile, breakable, and often used just to inspire poetry. In the harsh reality of medieval survival, you needed hard edges, adaptability, and a willingness to bend, or they'd bend you. A knight overly loyal to justice was often the first to fall in battle. You see, actual medieval knights were neither as glamorous nor as noble as stories portray. They were as flawed, fearful, and corruptible as any power-holding group. Don't be fooled by movies. Do you still see them as honourable after this? The truth is, many knights didn't die at the hands of enemies, but at the hands of honour, not honour, in the sense of keeping promises or living virtuously, but an invisible cage that tightened with every breath, every choice. In the Middle Ages, honour wasn't just a value, it was a life sentence of the spirit, a crown of thorns one wore without ever being allowed to take off. In an age without social media, you might think no one scrutinised your every move, but in truth, a knight's honour spread by word of mouth faster than the plague. People talked about you at banquets, in churches, on the battlefield, and especially behind your back. Actions weren't judged based on right or wrong, but through the lens of honour, a concept that varied wildly depending on region, religion, and class. For example, you retreat from a battle after your comrades die, hoping to bring the news home. Logical, even humane. But no, to society you're a coward. Lose your honour and you're socially dead. No one asks, are you okay, or are you wounded? They only ask, why didn't you die with your brothers? It was a kind of collective obsession, embedded into education, religion, and folklore. If you think men shouldn't cry as a modern idea, think again. Knights lived it in the 11th century. A knight had to keep a stone-cold face, even while bleeding, losing limbs, or watching comrades tortured to death. To cry was to lose honour. To complain was weakness. To flee was betrayal. Even self-defence had to be in knightly style. No ambushing, no begging for mercy, no kneeling to plead. Emotions, especially fear, were suppressed and denied. Many knights suffered severe psychological trauma, but were never allowed to show it. You could lose your honour simply because an enemy spread a lie, because a jealous noble made accusations, or because you survived a lost battle without witnesses. There are countless cases of knights returning from war covered in wounds, only to be branded cowards because no one saw them fight to the last breath. One rumour could destroy a lifetime, and because honour was invisible, unquantifiable, it was easily twisted by politics, power, or personal bias. Some were even forced into trial by combat, a duel to prove innocence. If you won, God had proven you were pure. If you lost, you didn't just die, you died disgraced. Where, then, is justice? One dark truth rarely discussed. Knights who died by suicide, not weakness, but because they had been humiliated publicly, wrongly accused, or stripped of dignity with no way to redeem themselves. Medieval documents often skirted the topic, using phrases like died of sorrow or succumbed to grief. But the reality is, many knights chose death over dishonour, and it wasn't weakness. It was the logical result of a system that valued reputation more than life. This created a vicious cycle. The more you clung to honour, the more you lived in fear. The more you feared dishonour, the easier it was for others to control you, because whoever defined honour controlled your soul. It's no coincidence that the concept of honour was exaggerated within the knightly class. It was a remarkably effective tool of social control. The church used honour to instill fear. He who betrays God is a traitor. Lords used honour to demand obedience. Refuse to fight and you're a disgrace. The court used honour to eliminate rivals. He's unworthy of his title. Honour wasn't just a virtue, it became currency, weapon, and shackle. A knight could be manipulated, sacrificed, or thrown into war simply because he feared losing face. In a world where every action was judged through the prism of honour, where was there space for compassion, forgiveness, or human vulnerability? The answer, almost none. Knights who dared show emotion, who protected peasants instead of killing them, were often branded unmanly, eccentric, or exiled from the noble circle. They lived between two worlds, one filled with inhumane rules coated in poetic language, the other with very human desires, to live, to love, to grieve. Medieval honour wasn't a reward, it was a trap, a beautiful gilded snare covered in thorns. It didn't protect knights, it imprisoned them within their own minds. And so, behind the shining armour, there was a heart full of fear, a soul strangled by pressure, and a man no longer allowed to be himself. Beyond the psychological burden, knights also carried a body that was aching, worn down, and constantly groaning. Knights weren't just mentally shackled by the weight of honour. They were physically exhausted, perpetually sore, and often moaning from spinal pain, aching knees, ulcerated wrists, and wounds that never quite healed. Many knights began training from a very young age, often around 7 years old, starting as a page, then moving on to squire, before being officially knighted. This meant they were wearing armour, riding horses, and practicing swordplay long before their bodies were fully developed. And this wasn't some light shirt hugging their shoulders. Knightly armour typically weighed 30 to 50 kilograms, 66 to 110 pounds, depending on the era and the knight's status. Imagine a 10-year-old child running, fighting, and leaping onto horses while carrying 2/3 of their body weight on their back. It's no wonder so many developed curved spines, deformed knees, and fused wrist joints from a young age. In fact, historical records note that you could distinguish a professional knight from an ordinary person by their walk, slow, rigid, hunched forward like a broken iron coat hanger. Here's something few people notice. The better the armour, the worse the visibility. Helmets were designed to protect the head, leaving only a narrow slit at eye level, sometimes only 2 fingers wide. That's why in many battles knights charged into each other like blind machines, relying only on body awareness and sound. Over time, this took a toll on their vision. Many lost their ability to see clearly at a distance after just 10-15 years on the battlefield. Some went completely blind in one eye due to metal fragments flying through the eye slit during combat. And don't forget, this was the Middle Ages. No glasses, no laser surgery. Eye remedies usually consisted of holy water or herb-infused dew collected over 3 nights. If you were impaled in the thigh by a lance, or had your shoulder shattered by a warhammer, what could you expect? No orthopaedic surgeons, no antibiotics, no painkillers beyond alcohol and perhaps a lucky charm. Many knights lived for months with open wounds, surviving by amputating damaged body parts. Pelvic fractures, spinal cracks, or shoulder breaks were often improperly set, resulting in a lifetime of limping, crooked arms, or even full-body paralysis. A 14th century record described one elderly knight who could no longer walk, could not sleep, breathed only to groan, and prayed for death as a mercy. Unlike in the movies, knights had no pensions, no veteran retirement homes, and no medals awarded for 30 years of service. When their bodies could no longer fight, they were quietly removed from the battlefield without fanfare. Some were sent to monasteries, others became gate guards, night patrolmen, or city watchmen. A few lived out their days in abandoned stables, unable to work, with no one left to care for them. The pain wasn't just in the flesh and bones, it sank deep into the spirit. And yet, these sufferings were never mentioned in the heroic ballads. One knight wrote, "I still hear my comrades screaming each night. Sometimes I dream I'm back on the battlefield, unable to move, and my horse is stepping on my face." There was no concept of PTSD back then, but the symptoms were unmistakable. Insomnia, extreme anxiety, emotional instability, self-harm, and in some cases suicide. Worse still, in the Middle Ages, such symptoms were often seen as demonic possession, or a shameful sign of weakness. The result? Many knights were abandoned, ostracized, or locked away in monasteries as a form of quarantine. That shining armour, the embroidered dragon cloak, the well-groomed warhorse, all created the glamorous image of a knight. But beneath it lay a deteriorating body, damaged organs, and a life shortened by years of iron and blood. Many knights died in their early 30s. Those who lived into their 40s or 50s could rarely walk properly. Most had missing teeth, failing eyesight, and weak lungs from inhaling battlefield smoke for years. Some monastic records describe aging knights who couldn't even relieve themselves unaided, needing help to remove their armour and be lifted, despite once being terrors on the battlefield. Medieval knights were not immortal symbols of strength. They were flesh and blood men, burdened by pain, illness, injury, and prolonged isolation. Glory, if it existed at all, lived only in the poetry, not in the aching knees or shattered vertebrae. When the glow of knightly honour faded, all that remained were groans in the night, from a man who once wore steel, wielded a sword and rode into battle, but now only wished for one peaceful sleep, unbroken by the pain in his back. Becoming a knight was never as glorious or enviable as we once thought. Don't be fooled by epics, poems, or films. War has never been beautiful, and those who fight in it have never been unscathed. The price they paid was far greater than what we ever see. The body may have been battered, but the mind of a medieval knight suffered no less. When people think of knights in the Middle Ages, they often picture shining armour, valiant war horses, razor-sharp swords, and unwavering loyalty to a lord. But behind the hardened shell of metal, few realise how many souls were crushed by trauma, loneliness, and psychological wounds that never healed. In medieval times, there was no understanding of mental health. What we now recognise as PTSD, depression, or anxiety was then seen through the lens of weak faith, lack of masculinity, possession by demons, or dishonour to one's name. A knight who admitted to hearing screams in his head after battle might be condemned as a heretic. Those who trembled, couldn't sleep, or had seizures were often believed to be possessed. And so, in a society where tears were signs of weakness and silence was a virtue, many knights chose to bury their pain, drowning it in alcohol, hunting or isolating themselves completely from the world. War in the Middle Ages was far from the glorious scenes painted in history books. It was the sight of men torn apart by axes, the sound of bones crushed beneath war horses, blood pooling beneath armour, the cries of dying comrades. These images and sounds haunted many knights for the rest of their lives. Numerous writings from the period, from hermits' journals to monks accompanying armies, describe knights suffering from insomnia, night terrors, and panic attacks. They would wake screaming the names of enemies or begging for mercy from those they'd once slain. But instead of being offered help, they were told to pray harder, or that loyalty would wash away all doubt. What they needed wasn't a confessor, it was a doctor, crushing responsibility but no shoulder to lean on. Unlike mercenaries or conscripted peasants, knights bore a sacred duty, to defend the honour of their lords, protect the realm, and embody the highest ideals of virtue and valour. But in reality, royal duty didn't save them from nightmares. No lord unbuckled their armour when their shoulder popped out of joint, and no glory could ever erase the guilt of stabbing a terrified 14-year-old boy on the battlefield. They were expected to never fall, never complain, never fear. But that didn't mean they were immune to sadness, regret, or the deep sense of betrayal by the very ideals they had sworn to uphold. One of the deepest tragedies of a knight's life was the feeling of being lost. After war, they couldn't return to being ordinary men. Sitting around the village hearth, they felt alien. The stories they carried, severed heads, best friends blown apart, were ones no villager wanted to hear, let alone understand. Yet they weren't true nobles either. Most lacked wealth or political power, and were seen by the upper class as little more than elite tools of war. They drifted between two worlds, belonging to neither, called friend by no one. Worse still, commoners feared them. The sight of a knight, even unarmed, made children cry, women turn away, and men avoid eye contact. In this loneliness, many knights became emotionally numb, bitter, or completely withdrawn. Some sought refuge in monasteries, not for peace, but to escape themselves. The world gave them no space to cry, so they sought to forget. Many became alcoholics, not out of preference, but because it dulled the pain. They drank to silence the screams of those they had slain, just for one night of dreamless sleep. Others took to hunting, torture, or cruelty, channeling their pain into the suffering of others. Sometimes the need to escape turned desperate. Some knights refused to return to war, were labelled cowards, and chose suicide as the only way to preserve their honour. A few fled their knightly status and lived disguised as commoners, but if caught, they were executed. The price of freedom was often death. The Middle Ages was a world where courage was celebrated, but emotional vulnerability was punished. In that world, no one asked a knight if he was okay. There was no time for healing conversations, no therapy rooms, no right to be wounded inside. Worse still, if a knight showed emotion, cried, panicked, or refused to kill, he was branded a traitor to his code, a disgrace to his kind. Honour did not allow public suffering, so the pain festered in silence, corroding the soul like rust eating through steel, unnoticed, until everything collapsed. The psychological wounds of knights are rarely told, because they don't fit the chivalric ideal history has romanticised. But they were real. Beneath iron armour and steely loyalty were shattered, weary souls, lost and too tired to find their way back. Knights didn't only die on battlefields, they died inside, piece by piece, in sleepless nights, in the fearful stares of villagers, and in the silence society demanded they maintain. Between the scars on their flesh and the torment in their minds, many withered away slowly, until they could no longer bear it, and sought release on their own terms. So, we ask you, which is more terrifying, physical pain or psychological pain? Let us know what you think. In modern imagination, knights symbolise loyalty, honour and indomitable spirit, but behind the gleaming armour and solemn oaths, many medieval knights were fragile pawns in a complex game of power involving kingdoms, the church, and the nobility. They fought for promises, but in return faced betrayal. They swore by honour but paid with loneliness, obscurity, or even the revocation of everything once promised. Knights, especially those without noble titles or land of their own, were often drawn by glittering offers from kings or religious leaders. Fight for the kingdom, and you will be granted land. Serve God, and your soul will be saved. Be loyal, and your lineage will be honoured forever. These words sounded heroic. But in an era where war served as principal diplomacy, such promises were often forgotten like a discarded chess piece. Many knights fought for decades without ever receiving land, or if they did, it was reclaimed when a king died or loyalty was questioned. One of the clearest examples of knights being used as political tools is the Crusades. Promoted as fighting for God to reclaim the Holy Land, the Crusades were in reality a power play by European forces to expand territory, control Middle Eastern trade routes, and consolidate political religious influence. Knights were the frontline force, sent to death for a sacred ideal they seldom fully understood. Many left home, family and property, only to die in foreign lands from fever, starvation, or friendly fire. All for promises of heavenly reward and land they never truly owned. Blind loyalty entrapped countless knights. In many cases, when a king or lord fell, his most loyal knights were branded traitors and faced imprisonment or execution. Knights were accused when their lord lost. They could not surrender, yet refusing allegiance to the victor made them rebels. Knights were forbidden to dissent. Any objection or refusal to fight was deemed treason. Knights were unprotected by law. Wounded or disabled, they received no support unless favoured by a lord. Their fate rested on their superiors. Even high-ranking knights saw titles and lands revoked if a monarch grew displeased, or if they were no longer useful. Land reclaimed under security justifications. Titles stripped with a single royal decree. Entire families persecuted or stripped of assets on fabricated charges of treason. Some knights were scapegoated simply for being on the losing side of court politics. Loyalty couldn't shield them from political knives. Many knights fought all their lives, earned honour after honour, and found their names erased from chronicles for being inconvenient to the ruling ideology. History glorifies victors. Defeated knights, even noble ones, are recorded as rebels. Their lifelong honour, which they defended with blood and oath, could be stripped overnight by political decree. The same foundations they stood on could vanish by sunrise. Often, knights realised too late they were tools for others to profit. Arms merchants, provisioning armies, profiting off every death. Lords expanding territory, exploiting war taxes. Clergy boosting the church's prestige through knightly conquests. Meanwhile, the real fighters, those who bled and died, got a few ceremonial praises and were soon forgotten. When the wars ended, thousands of knights found themselves lost. No land, no cause, irrelevant. Some became mercenaries, selling their skills to whoever paid. Others fell into poverty, living off charity. Some turned to banditry, taught to fight but never to live. Once heroes, they became burdens. Once national pride, they became forgotten. Yes, some knights truly embodied noble ideals, protecting the weak, living ethically, preserving honour. But many were victims of a system built on exploiting honour, a loyalty used as a tool for manipulation. Knights didn't just battle external enemies, they also fought betrayal, exploitation, and the steep cost of blind loyalty. In medieval power chess, knights appeared as rooks, strong and direct, but were actually pawns in polished steel. And like pawns, many were sacrificed to secure others' victories. They were more than just symbols of chivalry. They stood as painful evidence of the cost of honour, of unquestioning loyalty, and of lofty promises that turned hollow. They were just chess pieces, discarded or forgotten once their value ran out. When the war ended, people remembered the new king, the new ruler, but the knights who had fought with their very lives, whether still breathing or long fallen, were left to fade from memory. At the twilight of their lives, many knights faced a harsh and bitter reality. Oblivion. And not the kind of forgetfulness that comes naturally, but a deliberate erasure, as if society no longer had a place for those who had given their youth and blood in service of the crown. Unlike modern generals who are honoured upon retirement, medieval knights had no such support when they aged. No pension, no medals of honour, no farewell banquets or words of gratitude from the king. When a knight could no longer ride a horse or lift a sword, he simply became useless. Regardless of past glories, regardless of title, his worth was reduced to stories told around a fire, if anyone still cared to listen. Some knights, after leaving the battlefield, were forced to find ways to survive, something that seemed to contradict the honour they once wore like armour. But hunger knows no honour. Some became cheap mercenaries, taking dangerous work for minor lords. Others begged on the very roads they once paraded upon. When their deeds became memories, the once glorious armour was nothing but scrap metal, forgotten and rusting. For some, the end did not come in battle, nor in a public square, but in a monastery. There, they were allowed to live in peace. No war, no blood, no screams. But the price was a lifelong silence, a peace tinged with profound loneliness. The monastery was not a place of rest or celebration. It was where knights renounced glory, renounced the world, renounced the sword, and lived under the discipline of faith. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was a soft prison, where the only sound that tied them to the past was the distant echo of the church bell. They sat by windows, backs hunched, gazing into nothing, wondering, does anyone still remember me? Medieval society worshipped youth and strength. A 20-year-old knight could achieve glory that echoed across the land. But a 50-year-old knight, no matter how bravely he had fought, was deemed too old to charge, too slow to react. Each year brought a new crop of young men eager to don armour and make a name for themselves. Meanwhile, the old knights, however willing to fight, were left behind by their failing bodies. They were pushed further from the front lines, further from the public eye, until they faded from collective memory, like statues gathering dust in an abandoned castle. For many that was unbearable. When your entire life has been lived under the title knight, being cast aside like an old tool wounds deeper than any spear ever could. Not all knights died gloriously on the battlefield to the sound of triumphant horns. Many died silently in dark rooms, alone, without recognition, without title, without ceremony. No one told their stories. No one recorded them in history. They vanished as if they had never lived. And worse, those they once protected, those they fought for, often no longer remembered their names. Some graves lie unmarked beside monasteries. Some bones are found in forests with no name attached. And there are tales of old knights leaving their villages during a rainy night, never to return, as if they too did not want anyone to witness their final faded days. In the end, what made a knight's old age most painful was not the decay of the body, but the betrayal of time itself. They had fought for kings, for God, for honour. But once they could no longer serve, every oath, every promise, every ballad of valour became meaningless. The truth is, medieval society had no place for the weak and aged warrior. Loyalty only had value as long as strength remained. Once a knight could no longer wield his sword, no one cared for his loyalty. A knight's life, from the sandy training yard of his youth to the glory of the battlefield, was a journey of hardship. But its final chapter, old age, was perhaps the harshest trial of all. No one trained them to face being forgotten. No school taught them how to let go of glory. And no shield was strong enough to protect them from the loneliness, poverty, and emptiness of the forgotten warrior. Statues do not cry. But within the heart of every old knight, perhaps there was still a quiet corner waiting to be remembered, just once, as a living part of history that once blazed bright. In the end, the portrait of a knight, the figure so often romanticised as the pinnacle of medieval glory, reveals darker truths beneath its polished surface. Contrary to popular belief, not everyone had the opportunity or the desire to become a knight. Many were forced onto this path due to family expectations, rigid traditions, or simply because they had no other choice in the inflexible hierarchy of medieval society. Behind the shining armour were boys, barely 14 or 15, torn from home to learn how to kill, obey, and endure the cold, detached life of a soldier. What we call knightly glory was a privilege reserved for a lucky few, those with the right connections, the right battles at the right time, or the favour of the right king. The rest vanished into obscurity, dying nameless on muddy fields or fading into life as tired fortress guards. The truth is, many knights died leaving no trace in history, no gravestones, no grand funeral rites, no mention in any chronicle. The wars they fought in were often not for noble causes, but to expand a lord's influence or serve the political ambitions of the church. They fought for hollow promises, titles, land, or oaths of loyalty that were easily erased when fortunes turned. Their deaths were forgotten as quickly as their lives. No poems were written for those who died from sickness in the camp, or from infected wounds untreated due to lack of medicine. The idea of knightly honour was a beautiful but deceptive ideal. It was a noose around the neck of those in armour, binding them to battles even when defeat was certain. Knights were taught unwavering loyalty, to sacrifice themselves for their lord, their church, or a so-called righteous cause. But when the tide shifted, that same honour could not save them from execution or abandonment. In the end, honour was a tool, wielded by the ruling class to control military force and manipulate loyalty. As long as a knight was useful, he was a hero. But when he failed, he became a traitor, or worse, an incompetent, stripped of titles, rights, and sometimes even his name. We romanticize knights because it is easier than facing the truth. We prefer to see them as steadfast symbols of courage and loyalty. But that very idealization often causes us to overlook their humanity. Their unhealed wounds, sleepless nights haunted by nightmares, the numb loneliness in stone halls, or the silent weeping for home, for regrets after massacres. When period dramas show knights galloping across fields, they rarely mention that most knights actually marched on foot. When comics celebrate their triumphs, they omit the syphilis, the lice, the skin diseases, and the aftermath of drunken escapades during long campaigns. Glory is a glossy veneer painted over a deeply cracked wall. The knight was a symbol of a stratified society, where individuals were forced into roles from an early age, with little hope of escape. They were tools for political conquest, human shields for monarchs, pawns in diplomatic games. Whatever greatness they achieved came at a steep cost, not only in blood, but in youth, humanity, and sometimes their very soul. A few became legends recorded in history books, but the vast majority, those who died in remote outposts, who spent decades guarding borders, who succumbed to untreated wounds, remained statistical footnotes. They were not remembered by name. No statues were built, and no one ever asked, did they wish for a different life? To acknowledge the darker side of knighthood is not to deny its values, but rather than blindly celebrate the ideal, we must see it fully. Knights were human, flesh and blood, capable of pain, fear, mistakes, and longing. Their sacrifice, if it means anything, must be seen in context, not just as heroes, but as victims of an era, a system, and an ideal of honour that was often unforgiving. We must retell their story, not to lull ourselves with legend, but to awaken compassion for those who lived in history's shadow. Knights were not characters from fairy tales. They were emblems of a turbulent age, where ideals clashed with reality, where honour came with suffering, and where silent deaths arrived long before any songs of praise. To truly understand them, we must strip away the gleam and look at the raw human beneath, where blood, tears, and loneliness linger after every battle. And so, the journey of the medieval knight ends, not with the thunder of hooves or the flash of steel, but with weary sighs beneath rusted armour, with quiet pain on a splintered wooden bed inside the cold walls of a monastery. The glory of knighthood is but a painted mask, adorned by poetry, legend, and the selective reverence of history. Beneath the cape lies hunched backs, wounds that never healed, and eyes that once saw through iron helms, now clouded with tears and time. They were human, nothing more, nothing less, with hopes, fears, and, in the end, the silence of being forgotten. Close your eyes. Let the echoes of jousting fade into the night wind. Let the image of those once mighty warriors, now sitting quietly by candlelight in a cloister, lull you into a gentle sleep. For sometimes, what was once deemed the noblest path carried the deepest tragedy. And when you wake, in a modern world full of choices and freedom, remember ideals should not obscure truth, should not. Titles should not eclipse humanity. And the greatest thing we can offer, above all, remains our empathy for every soul who was once called a hero. Sleep well, in dreams untouched by war or rusted medals, where only the light of understanding, forgiveness and compassion glows softly, for all who once bore the name knight.